Okay, good evening and welcome to New Canaan Library. Thank you for joining us tonight to hear Katharine Hayhoe deliver the inaugural Oldham Nature and Environment Lecture. Well, our former Executive Director and CEO, Lisa Oldham, who many of you knew, was passionate in her pursuit of climate action through conservation, mitigation, adaptation, and importantly for us, education. Upon her retirement, the Oldham Nature and Environment Lecture Series was created by a group of donors in her honor to bring leading scientists, policymakers, and other experts to speak about the ways that climate change is affecting our world and to keep us well informed on the topics of climate science, policy, and biodiversity loss. Tonight, we are very privileged to present world-renowned atmospheric scientist Katharine Hayhoe, Chief Scientist of the Nature Conservancy and Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Public Policy, and Public Law at Texas Tech University. Katharine is one of foreign policy's 100 leading global thinkers and was chosen by Fortune as one of their world's greatest leaders. She is also an evangelical Christian and has spoken widely about the intersection of faith and climate action, sharing her compelling and constructive perspectives on podcasts, programs, and in print. It was long Lisa's fervent wish to bring Katharine to New Canaan because of Katharine's remarkable ability to make climate issues accessible and meaningful for a broad spectrum of people. Though Lisa couldn't be with us in person tonight, we have a special video message from her to welcome Katharine.
I'm Lisa Oldham, former Director and CEO of New Canaan Library for 11 wonderfully rewarding years. I cherish my time in the New Canaan community, during which I formed lasting bonds with so many of you. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you tonight, albeit from afar. Thank you so much for all being here, and thanks to the many people whose hard work and generosity has made tonight possible. 16 months ago, Kate Cannon, library supporter and my good friend, suggested creating a lecture series to celebrate my time at the library and my leadership from the library building. From the beginning, it was clear that the series should focus on nature, climate, and the environment. Looking after our natural world has been a lifelong passion of mine. Growing up in a family of outdoors people, gardeners, fishers, hunters, and hikers, I have always understood how deeply interconnected we are with the natural world. As it has become undeniable how much damage we've done to our planet in my lifetime alone, my passion for the environment has only grown. The picture behind me is from our recent visit to Glacier National Park, where the impacts of climate change are so very clear. The glaciers for which it is named are disappearing. They have already shrunk by 80%. We didn't see any. I believe that those of us who've been blessed with so much have a corresponding responsibility to make the world a better place, acting locally and globally to leave behind a healthy planet Earth where not only our grandchildren but all future generations can thrive. The majority of Americans are worried about climate change and want to learn more about what they can do. Happily, learning is the cornerstone of the library mission. How marvelous to have a lecture series where New Canaan residents can learn directly from leading experts. I could not be more thrilled to have Katharine Hayhoe deliver the inaugural Lisa Oldham Lecture. Not only is she one of the most respected and sought-after climate scientists in the world, but I believe that Katharine's message of hope, rooted in faith, based in rigorous science, is the inspiration we need to turn our worries and fears into positive, lasting change. Please warmly welcome Katharine.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful introduction. I am so honored to be here, to provide the inaugural lecture on this topic. And I love the dual focus on nature and climate, because so often people are like, oh, well, I'm a climate person. And then somebody else is like, well, I'm a nature person. Well, you can't have one without the other. Nature doesn't need us. We're the ones who need nature. And through climate change, which is happening faster than any time we can see on this planet, as far back as we can go in the history of the planet, we're putting nature at risk, and our own life depends on nature. So that's why I am a climate scientist. It's also why I'm the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, because the two go hand in hand. And what's even better, that I'll talk about today, is that the solutions go hand in hand too. You don't need solutions that are only nature solutions or only climate solutions. We can have both together, that invest in climate, invest in biodiversity, and invest in people's well-being and health at the same time. I want to tell you 4 things if this is the way you feel. And if this is not the way you feel, I bet you know people who feel this way. So these are the 4 things I want you to know. Number 1 is, if you feel this way, you are not alone. A survey of 10,000 young people in 12 countries around the world, including the US, found that most of them feel either extremely worried or very worried. Extremely or very is almost 60%. They also felt sad, afraid, anxious. Now you might say, well, that's just young people. Let's look at the whole US. This is a map of the US with every county showing. I was interested to learn, not being from Connecticut, I didn't know this, that the planning regions are what show up on this map, not the counties. Isn't that weird? So by planning region, here you have where we are today in Western Connecticut planning region. 76% of people in this region would say they're worried about global warming, and across the whole country, 64% would. And look at where I live in Texas. Would you have thought that Texas, most of Texas was orange, which means more than half the people saying they're worried? In fact, there was a survey last September in Texas that found that 43% of registered Republican voters in Texas were worried about climate change. 96% of registered Democrat voters in Texas were worried. And when we look around the world, this is what we see. The gray is countries that weren't surveyed, and here the bar is a little higher. You have to be over 60% to be pink here. Just about every country is pink, and the only countries that are not pink are countries where literally you don't even know if you're going to wake up and have enough food to eat the next day, or a bomb's going to hit your house. So aside from the places where people literally don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, the vast majority of people are worried. And in fact, in many areas like Mexico and Latin America and Europe and India, people are much more worried than here. So the number one question that I've been getting from people that I've been talking to for the last 5, 7, 8 years is, what gives you hope? And this is very much reflected in resources we see becoming available, like a field guide to climate anxiety. I figured since we're in a library, it's good to talk about books, right? So there's books specifically written to, if you're worried, what do you do? Books like How to Live in a Chaotic Climate. And the book I wrote, Saving Us, specifically to address the number one question I get from people, which is, where do you find hope? So if you're worried, if you're concerned, if you're anxious, if you feel despair, first of all, you're not alone. You're not the only one. In fact, the majority of people feel that way. Number 2, though, and this is really important, you are not too sensitive. You are not suffering from any type of mental health issue. In fact, when psychologists got together a couple of years ago to talk about eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, they said very clearly and firmly, this is not a mental health issue in terms of, something that needs to be fixed. It is actually a rational response. If you're worried, you understand the actual facts. You understand that we are conducting an experiment with our home and it's not going so well. You understand that, over history, Earth's temperature has gone up and down by a few tenths of a degree over the history of human civilization on this planet. Just like your body temperature goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree every day. That's normal and it's natural. But our planet is running a fever. Our temperature has soared by more than 1.3 degrees Celsius, which is well over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's the same as if your body were running a 2 degree. What would you do if you were running a 2 degree temperature? You'd be taking some Tylenol. You'd be wondering who coughed on you or what you ate. You'd be taking a COVID test. You'd be calling the doctor. That's exactly what's happening to our planet. If you were running a 2 degree fever, you would be worried. And if our planet is running a 2 degree fever, we should all be worried. In fact, those of us who have the problem are the ones who are not worried about this. Now, this is why we often refer to this issue as global warming, because we scientists use the average temperature of the planet as a measure of where it's going. For those of us who don't monitor what satellites and thousands of thermometers around the world are saying, it's really not so much global warming that we notice as what I call global weirding, right? Wherever we live, things are getting weird. And one of my favorite things to do now when I'm in an Uber, I haven't had a car actually for 2 years, which is pretty amazing in Dallas. But fortunately, there's a lot of Ubers, especially electric Ubers. And whenever I take an Uber and, people are chit-chatting, I just ask people about the weather. And I hear all about the floods that closed the roads, or the record heat, or the crazy storms, or the fact that they've got family in Florida or North Carolina. We all have weather stories. In fact, as of last year, 9 out of 10 Americans said that they had been personally affected by extreme weather. And 2/3 of them linked that to climate change. With due cause, because wherever we live, it's as if we have this pair of weather dice. And we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally, right? We've always had heat waves, we've always had floods, we've always had hurricanes and wildfires. But as the world gets warmer decade by decade, it's like it's sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and turning it into another 6. And then it's taking another number and turning it into a 6. And then it's even putting a number we've never seen before on our dice. And so wherever we live, could you still roll a 1 or a 2? Sure. But we're rolling a lot more 6s and even some unprecedented 7s these days. We're seeing that when our heat waves happen, they're a lot stronger and more frequent than they used to be. When droughts happen, they're more intense and they're lasting longer. Most wildfires in the lower 48 states are the result of accidental human ignition. Only about 7% are arson, the rest are power lines sparking, or somebody leaving something plugged in the shed that they shouldn't have, or gender reveal party fireworks. That was a real one. As was the person who dumped a load of burning trash into the dry brush. So we've always had people doing stupid things, right? But as climate change comes along, it's the difference between accidentally dropping that match into a pile of bone-dry kindling versus a pile of pretty green, wet wood. You all know what happens if you try to light a fire with green, wet wood, right? Not much. But if you have dry leaves, dry twigs, dry wood, it just goes off, right? You've got a bonfire in your hands, and that's what's happening with climate change. The area burned by wildfires is much bigger than it used to be. And then let's talk about hurricanes. So are we seeing more frequent hurricanes than we used to? We're actually not. The total number of hurricanes goes up and down from year to year, but we haven't seen a change in the number. What we are seeing a change in is the strength of the hurricanes. These days, they're ratcheting up from a tropical storm to a Category 5 overnight. That's what Milton actually did. And not only that, but they're dumping way more rain on us. Why is this happening? It's happening because they're powered by warm ocean water. And the warmer the ocean gets, the more energy is available for that storm to power up into a giant hurricane that is bigger and stronger and slower, and it dumps a lot more rain on us than it would have 50 or 100 years ago. So scientists are actually able to calculate just how bad this is getting. And you see that there's records every day. Warmest month on record, warmest year on record, warmest oceans on record. And then the headlines, of course. We see headlines all the time now. Every week there's new headlines. The headlines on Helene had not even finished when the headlines on Hurricane Milton knocked them out of first place. In the US, back in the 1980s, we used to have $1 billion weather or climate disaster on average every 4 months. So that's about 3 a year. By the 2010s, we were having one every 2.8 weeks. And last year, because we haven't finished this year yet, last year we had one every 1.8 weeks. Yeah. So the disasters are mounting. It is not your imagination. We are seeing more frequent flooding. We are seeing more frequent heat waves. We're seeing bigger wildfires. We're seeing much more damaging hurricanes. And we scientists are starting to put a number on how much worse climate change made it. So, for example, with the recent hurricanes, would they have occurred 100 years ago? Yes. Would they have been as damaging even if we had the same amount of people and property in their way? No. The deadly floods Germany had 3 years ago were 9 times more likely. The crazy heat wave they had in the Pacific Northwest in June 2021, 150 times more likely. The rain that fell during Hurricane Helene, half that rain would not have happened if it weren't for climate change loading the weather dice against us. So we can put a number on how much climate change is costing us. And the poster child for this happened in Texas. Back in 2017, we had what is, up until now, the most costly hurricane on record, and those rains were 3 times more likely and directly responsible for 2/3 of the direct costs. Isn't that stunning? Climate change is costing us billions of dollars. So people often say, oh, it's going to cost us so much to fix climate change. And the best answer I've heard is, compared to what? Because letting it rip is going to be a lot more expensive than anything we do to fix it. And in fact, they've even tracked, for example, that 1/3 of the burned forests across the western US and Canada over the last 40 years can be directly traced back to specific companies. I feel like this is going to be required reading in a lot of legal schools pretty soon. So why do all of these extremes matter? People often say, well, how can we choose between people or the planet, the economy or the environment? We don't have to choose. It's either all of us together or nothing. Because the air we breathe is literally being affected by this. The water we drink is being affected. The food that we eat is being affected. The buildings and the roads and all the infrastructure that we have was built for a planet that doesn't exist anymore. And you just saw how many billions of dollars it's costing us. And what about the nature that surrounds us? Remember when I started, I said, nature doesn't need us. We need nature. Where does the oxygen we breathe come from? Half of it comes from phytoplankton in the ocean. 20% of it comes from kelp. The rest comes from trees. If all of nature disappeared off the face of this earth and it was just humans left with nothing else, we'd be done for, right? So caring about nature is not somehow antithetical to who we are. Caring about the nature that surrounds us, and remember, 70% of our planet is ocean, the nature on which we depend that we might not see unless we're along the coast, it's essential to our well-being and our survival. So people often talk about saving the planet, and I say no. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. Doesn't matter what we do, it will still be orbiting the sun. The question is, will we? And I put a little asterisk there to be very clear, because when I say us, I am not only talking about humans. I'm talking about all of us living things. What distinguishes us from the rest of nature is simply we're causing the problem, we understand what's happening, and we're the ones who can do something to fix it. That's what distinguishes us. But we are all sharing this home together, and it's up to us to make sure it continues to be a safe home for all of us. So if you're concerned, if you're worried, you're not alone. It means you understand what's happening. You're having a rational response to what's happening. But now, here's where it gets really interesting. And here's where I might be challenging a little bit of some of the things that you think. Worry is good, because if we don't know there's a problem, why would we want to fix it, right? But it's only good if we know what to do. And guess what? Most people don't know what to do. So we often think, and do you remember the question I asked you? Do you think other people are worried or not worried? And we kind of had a pretty, in the middle was the average, slightly worried, mildly worried was your number one answer. We think that me and everybody I know were worried, but most other people who don't want to talk about it are not worried. This is the way we think people are. And if this is the case, what do we have to do? Well, it's very clear. We have to load up our wheelbarrow, so to speak, with all of the scary, very true facts, and we have to dump it on them. And that'll move them from not worried to worried. So what we do is we take things like this viral sea surface temperature plot that was all over social media this past year, and we share it and share it and share it. Now, last May, a really interesting study came out, not by climate scientists, by social scientists who study how people interact with information. And they found, this is a direct quote, they found that doom-filled headlines get the most clicks and shares. So this explains why when you read news online about climate change, 99.9% of it is doom-filled. Why? Because it gets clicks and shares. What does for-profit media need? Clicks and shares. It gets the most clicks and shares, but in the small print below, and this is literally what the author said, they said it's the absolute worst at motivating people to act. Why? Well, climate changes and we get worried. We load up our wheelbarrow and we dump it on people, right? And then everybody springs into action. No, that's not what happens. People just tune out. Pretty soon you might see people edging away from you at parties. And nothing happens. Why? Well, one of the most interesting books I read was by a neuroscientist called Tali Sharot. And in this book called The Influential Mind, which you probably have here, and I highly recommend it, she said some very interesting things about the way our brains work. And one of the things she said really stood out to me. She said, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And so climate just changes more. Now, she wasn't talking about climate change. She was talking about how our brain works. So this whole time, we've been trying to do something that actually runs counter to the way our brain works. Now, when you look at public opinion data, which we've already done, right, it turns out that this is not what we look like. What we actually look like is this. In the United States, 2/3 of people are worried about climate change. Right here in this part of Connecticut, 3/4 of people are worried about climate change. But a survey done by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, which is just up the road from you in New Haven, a study they did at Yale found last year that the number of people who were worried and activated, 8%. So let me ask you this question. Do you think it's more important to move the people who claim they're not worried? I think some of them are. They're just pushing it down so hard that they won't even admit it. Do you think it's more important to move the yellow into the blue or to move the blue into the green? I'm pretty solidly in the camp B because the whole world could be worried but paralyzed. And what's going to happen? We're doomed anyways. We're just doomed more unhappily. If there's nothing we can do, if we're all going to be paralyzed by worry, I would rather, as Solomon says, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. I don't want the world to all be worried and paralyzed. I want us to be activated. Well, isn't it a lot easier to take people who are already worried and help them become activated? They already understand there's a problem. That's step one. They're already there. You don't have to convince them there's a problem. They know there is, but they don't know what to do. Why are they not activated? Well, it turns out that research has shown that it isn't because they're not worried. They are. And in fact, more worry paralyzes them. The main reason why most people are worried but not activated is because we haven't connected our head to our heart. We don't understand why it matters to me, my life, where I live, the people and places and things I love. We understand the polar bears. We understand the ice sheets. We understand the future, but we don't understand what's happening here. That's the head to heart. But then we haven't made the heart to hands connection. We don't know what we can do to fix it. And I don't know about you, but I'm firmly in the camp of where if there's something that's really stressful and really depressing that I'm really anxious about, but there's nothing I can do about it, I don't like to talk about it. Now, there's a few people I know, I have a few family members, you probably do too, who do. And I don't want to talk about it with them either. If there's nothing I can do about it, I don't want to talk about it. So unfortunately, most of us do fall into that category, and that's why a lot of us don't talk about this, is because we don't know what to do. So how do we tackle these problems? The first problem actually has a name. It's called psychological distance, and it is a very well-known human defense mechanism that we use all the time. We don't eat what we're supposed to be eating. We don't stand up and walk around every 30 minutes, even though I have a watch that beeps at me telling me to. Most people don't do the things that we know we're supposed to do anyways because we just see them as being far off. Oh, it won't affect me until long in the future. Or that just matters to people who live over there, not here. Or it's just a sort of abstract concern but not relevant to my personal life. And when it comes to climate change, we see all of these manifested here today, and I have the data to prove it. So going back to these maps from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, they've asked people, is global warming happening? And you can see pretty much every county in the US says yes, right? This is a pretty dark orange map. And then they ask people, will it harm plants and animals? Where's the psychological distance there? Non-human species, right? So it's not quite as relevant to me. You know, sorry for the plants, sorry for the animals, sorry, Sir David Attenborough. But, you know, at least it's not me. So most people agree it will harm plants and animals. And then the researchers asked, do you think it will harm future generations? Yes. Now you might think this is the same map. It's not. There's little tiny variations, but very high numbers. Then they said, will it harm people who live far away? Slight decrease, but mostly yes, right? And then they asked this, will it harm you? Isn't that amazing? And right here, it's just at 50%. Now, as a scientist, let me be clear. Is it harming you? Yes. Could I tell you ways that wherever you live in the United States is directly affecting your life? Absolutely. But this is that head-to-heart gap. Even people who are worried don't think it affects them. Now, that is changing quickly thanks to these extreme weather events I mentioned. But it isn't changing quickly enough because we're not talking about what's happening where we live and how that affects the people and places and things we love. So you might say, is this just a US problem? No, it's a human issue. Remember, I showed you this map at the beginning, who all is worried about climate change. And then they asked people around the world, do you think it will affect future generations? You can see it got a bit lighter, right? And then they said, do you think it will affect you? All of us are prone to psychological distance. So how do we overcome this problem? Well, it's actually not that hard, sadly. I wish it were hard. But today, there are so many things we can talk about what is happening now, not in the future. What's happening here, not over there. What's happening in things that affect my life. We were talking earlier today with students, and they were saying, well, how do I have conversations with my friends? And I said, well, start with something your friends care about. I said, for example, take soccer. You know, they're having to reschedule soccer games. They had to reschedule games in the World Cup because the extreme heat is affecting players. But there's all kinds of soccer and football clubs around the world who are making positive changes in what they're doing to encourage people to change. And then one of the girls said, oh, I'm sorry I have to leave. I'm going to my soccer practice. I was like, well, there you go. You got a whole team you can have a conversation with. So that's step number one. But what is step number two? Step number two is the heart-to-hands connection. What can we do? People want solutions. We want, if there's a problem that we're worried about, we want something to do about it. We want solutions, and we want that solution to give us something better, not something worse. And people are willing to change if they think what they do will make a difference. And the word for this is efficacy. Why would you do something if you don't think it's going to make a difference? We all want to feel like if we do something, it makes a difference. And unfortunately today, we don't. In the US, over half of people feel helpless. In other words, they have no clue what to do. And 50% don't know where to start. And I'm very sorry to say this because I know that the library has an excellent recycling program. Most people around the world think that the number one thing we can do as an individual is recycle. Now, I want to be clear, I recycle with the best of them. If anyone in my family puts a can or a plastic bottle in the garbage, they are herded to the garbage, forced to pick it out of the garbage, forced to wash it and put it in the recycling. So I recycle with the best of them, and I was taught that as a child, as so many of us were. But as a scientist, I know that, first of all, only 8% of plastic is actually recycled. So the best thing we can do with plastic is not have it in the first place. Aluminum, cardboard, those are actually really easy and good to recycle. But I also know that, frankly, recycling helps with pollution and waste, but it doesn't really make a difference with climate change. Yeah. Now, again, I'm not saying it's not important to do. I recycle a lot, but it has really almost nothing to do with climate change. It doesn't produce heat-trapping gases or prevent them. Food waste now. Food waste does have something to do with climate change. When food breaks down, it does produce heat-trapping gases. So reducing and eliminating food waste, and that includes things like composting and things like that, that does affect climate change, but recycling itself does not. So how do we tackle the head-to-heart gap, psychological distance, and how do we tackle the heart-to-hands gap, build efficacy, so people feel like they can make a difference? These maps were really helpful to me when I was asking myself this question, because it turns out they have the beginning of the answer. We left off here. Do you think climate change will affect you personally? Most people saying no. There's one map that is darker blue. And that darker blue map is when the researchers asked people, do you ever talk about it? Look at that. Do you ever talk about it? Around the country, just over a third of people ever even hear somebody else talking about it occasionally. They didn't ask every week. They were like once in a while. And right here in the Western Connecticut planning region, it's only at 44%. I zoomed in here because it turns out this region is that light blue region right there. If you go over to where New Haven is, which again is the home of Yale University, where researchers created these maps, they're at 39%. Remember, here's 44. So New Haven's at 39, and when you get to the far eastern side of Connecticut, they're down below the national average. And again, I don't want you to feel bad. This is a human problem. This is the same map. Are you worried about climate change? And then they asked people around the world, guess what? They were a bit more stringent. They said you talk about it at least once a week. Now, what's fascinating about this map is I don't have any proof, but I have a strong suspicion that you can actually see the influence of a single human being on this map. The darkest country, or actually the highest number, because there's a couple of countries that are the same color, the highest number on this map is for the country of Sweden. And Sweden is known for, among other things, being the home of a young woman who just over 5 years ago, wasn't that long ago, I think at age 13, she took a piece of white cardboard and she wrote the signs "School Strike for Climate" on that piece of white cardboard, and she went and sat outside a building. And that building was the Swedish Parliament, and her name was Greta Thunberg. And through that, she started an international conversation about climate change. Isn't that amazing? Talk about efficacy. So here's the connection, because when I say talk, I often get a very visceral reaction from people. People say, talk, we've had enough talk, we need action. Well, if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you do anything about it? And as I showed you from the data, we aren't talking about it. Is talking enough? Of course not. But is it a necessary first step? Yes. When do humans ever do anything without talking about it? Now, the next thing people often say is, aha, give me the tools to go out and argue with Uncle Joe. Right? Give me the tools to talk to my neighbor, my colleague, my family member who's over in that brown category there. Because I have been just waiting to stick it to them for years. I have some good news and some bad news for you. First of all, one of the reasons why I believe this group is called dismissive is because they would dismiss an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame. And if they would dismiss that, what chance do you or I have of convincing them? Frankly, none. So if we know someone who's dismissive, my best advice is to say, I'm sorry, you're wrong. Now, how about that sports team or that weather? If they're your relative, you can say, I love you. I'm sorry, you're wrong. Now let's talk about the weather. And actually, before you know it, they might be telling you how weird the weather is, which is great. But I'm not advocating for talking with that 11%. The good news is, with everybody else, there is a secret to having these positive conversations. And there is a way to move people along the spectrum. And this is through what I just said is the connecting the head to the heart. How do we do that? Well, all too often, we want to start these conversations with what we care about, right? Isn't that what we all do as humans? And so I'm like, well, I care passionately about polar bears, and I keep telling people about how the polar bears are being affected by climate change, and pretty soon it's the edging away from me at the party happening, because they're like, oh, here she goes again. Is that an effective way to have conversations with people? It isn't. Why not? Because I would be starting with what I care about. And what do people most enjoy talking about? Themselves and what they care about. So what is the first step in a positive, constructive conversation that helps people connect their head and their heart? The first step is to ask them questions and listen. Figure out what they care about. Instead of polar bears, you might find out they care about farming, like Jack. Jack is a cotton farmer in West Texas, and he has told me all about how he has not had a decent harvest since 2005. So with Jack, I talk about rainfall and heat and cotton yields and farming. This is my colleague Joellen. She lives in Arizona. She has to wake up her kids before dawn in the summer because that is the only time they can go outside to play. So Joellen and I are part of an organization called Science Moms. And we're all about, as mothers, talking about how climate change affects our kids' health. And we talk to other parents about that. What about the air you breathe? Who was here for this last year? I apologize. That did come from over the border, but on the other hand, the cause for it came a lot from the US. So we can talk about, oh my gosh, it was so hard to breathe. I couldn't let my kids play outside. Who doesn't have that in common? Superstorm Sandy. This is a picture from Brooklyn, New York, of someone's home. And increasingly, we're seeing insurance rates skyrocket in Minnesota, in Florida, in California, and more. We can talk about that. In fact, our homeowners association fees just went up 70%. And so I don't know if any of you are on the HOA chat, but it went wild. And so I figured, well, let me look at it because who knows why it happened. So I looked at it, and guess what was the main reason why our HOA fees went up? Insurance. And the rest of it was landscaping from all the landscaping that had been wiped out by the floods. So I just sent everybody an article. I didn't say anything. I just sent an article on home insurance rates in Texas and how they were changing due to climate change. And the discussion kind of stopped there. Or we can talk about, oh my gosh, the floods, right? The floods, and you probably saw some of these videos, the floods in the subway in New York. You can talk about your commute. To care about climate change, you don't have to be a certain type of person, you just have to be human. And so step one is to figure out what people already care about. I have started conversations with people over a shared love of chocolate. Did you know that 2/3 of the world's cocoa crops were almost wiped out this year thanks to mold growing because of unseasonable rain linked to climate change? I've started conversations over beach vacations because we're losing beach area every year and replenishment isn't going to cut it. I've even started conversations over knitting. And goodness, if you can start a conversation over that, you can start a conversation over anything. We have to figure out what people already care about and then help them connect the dots. So that's the first step, but what's the second step? Head, heart, and then hands. Exactly. How do we do that? Well, for the hands, we have to talk about solutions. And when it comes to solutions, there's no one solution that's going to fix it all. There is no one silver bullet that if everybody did X, that would fix the whole problem. That's the bad news. But the good news is there's so much silver buckshot that when we add it all up, we have more than enough of what we need to fix the problem. I've learned that this doesn't work in Europe. People are like, what's that? So if you come up with a better analogy, let me know, because I think this one really works, but I understand it doesn't necessarily translate. So what do climate solutions look like? To understand climate solutions, I like to use the example of a swimming pool, specifically an above-ground swimming pool like the one I grew up with in my backyard in Toronto. Imagine that the atmosphere is a swimming pool, and the level of water in the pool is the level of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, for most of human history, we had just the right amount of water in the pool that our toes could just touch the ground. But then, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we stuck a hose in the swimming pool, and we've been turning the hose up every year. So what's happening to the level of water in the pool? It's going up, and it's not just going up, it's going up faster and faster because we're turning the hose up every year. So what's the first thing we have to do? You got to turn off the hose, right? First of all, stop turning it up and then turn it off. But our pool also has a drain. And that drain is nature. And by making the drain bigger, we can take up a lot of the water in the pool. So the second category of solutions is to make the drain bigger. But then there's one more thing we have to do. The level of water in the pool is so high that a lot of people, their toes can't touch the ground anymore. We also have to learn how to swim and help other people learn how to swim. That's adaptation and resilience. So what is net zero? Net zero is when the hose equals the drain. When the hose equals the drain, the level of water in the pool stops rising. Could we make the level of water in the pool go down? We actually could if we turn the hose all the way off, but then we keep on making the drain bigger, we can even make the water go down. So what do these solutions look like? Well, when I say turn off the hose, people often immediately say, clean energy. And you're right, but that's not number one. Number one is efficiency. Did you know that we waste over 60% of the energy we produce in this country? Efficiency saves money. The cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. And then we can replace the fossil fuels we use with clean energy. And that is happening faster and faster. I live in Texas, where we have more wind and more utility scale solar than any other state. That's right, Texas just passed California for solar this year. But what's happening in Texas is nothing compared to what's happening in China. China installed more solar last year than the rest of the world put together, and than the US has in its entire history. So this is happening. That hose is turning. Land use, deforestation and land conversion to agriculture instead of nature, that's responsible for 22% of the problem, 22% of the hose. And then we can change how we use energy, and then for the last few drops in the hose, the really expensive, energy-intensive technologies like carbon capture and storage that essentially cuts a slit in the hose before it gets to the pool and takes out a couple of drops and stores them underground. But gosh, it can't take care of the whole hose. It's for the last few drops. So how do we make the drain bigger? People often say, tree planting, right? But that's number 3. Number 1 is protecting what we have. What we already have, especially old growth forests, has so much carbon in it that we have to protect that first. Then we need to restore our coastal wetlands, our grasslands, the preserves that we have right here. Then we need to replace what we've taken away, regenerating ecosystems right in the middle of cities, as well as in surrounding land between fields and natural areas. Climate-smart agriculture has a huge role to play. Agriculture is the only sector that can be flipped from the hose to the sink. Isn't that amazing? Right now, agriculture is a net producer of heat-trapping gas emissions. It contributes, again, through deforestation and animal agriculture to 22% of the hose. It could be flipped to a sink where it takes carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it back in the soil where we want it. And then for the last few drops down the drain, there's the expensive, energy-intensive technology like direct air capture, where you run air through a filter and it literally sucks the CO2 out of the air and then puts it underground. But it's really expensive and it requires a lot of energy. So we need all the solutions, but that is not a magic fix-it. Now, what's the last thing we have to do? Do you remember? Turn off the hose, make the drain bigger, and exactly, learn how to swim. Thank you. I like the person in the front row. Exactly. How do we do that? Well, there's all kinds of ways to do that. We have to adapt and engineer our built environment, and I've worked with transportation engineers for 10 years to look at how they design asphalt and bridges and culverts to make sure that we still have infrastructure that works. Using technology, did you know in Africa, farmers, because technology gets leapfrogged, right? Farmers in Africa are using apps that tell them when the rain's coming, what type of crop to plant, when and where, adapting to climate change using technology. When we green our cities, we make them more flood and heat resilient. And of course, social adaptation, which people are working on really hard with hurricanes, but boy, is that difficult. Everybody knows someone who refused to leave their home. I was talking to so many friends before Milton who had family in Tampa or Sarasota who flat out refused to leave. And then there's people who are even refusing FEMA aid today, and all kinds of misinformation and disinformation circulating the internet. Unfortunately, with social adaptation, we're really moving in the opposite direction, putting ourselves more at risk, just at a time when we need to learn how to swim. So I mentioned earlier that there's solutions that can do multiple things. We don't have time for solutions that do one thing. We need solutions that do a lot of things, like what? Solutions that clean up our air and our water. Did you know that the particulates from burning fossil fuels, just the particulates, I'm not talking about the heat-trapping gases or the carbon emissions, I'm just talking about like the dirty little particulates that you can see in the air, they're responsible for more deaths every year than all the people who died from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. Where are the headlines about that? I've only seen one headline written by David Wallace Wells in the New York Times that actually said that, and that was 2 years ago, and that's the only headline I've seen. So cleaning up our dirty sources of energy would actually provide so many health improvements. Who cares about climate change? We already have enough reasons right now for that. So I just wrote an essay with a medical doctor in the British Medical Journal yesterday, talking about how healthcare leaders need to be talking about climate action as an action for health. We also know that protecting our coastal wetlands protect us from storm surge. We know that our physical and mental health depends on having thriving nature around us. We know that today, solar energy plus storage, because I don't know if you've heard this, but the sun doesn't shine at night. I say that because if I had $1 for every person who says that to me, I could have a really good lunch every day. There is such thing as storage, and in fact, it's really fascinating in Texas. There are at least 5 different types of storage that are actively being explored and put on the grid. Not just batteries, gravity storage, super simple. Giant heavy blocks that at night, when wind energy is super cheap, they lift up and then they slowly lower them during the day when it's expensive. They're also pumping water underground under pressure. They're drilling for geothermal energy, which runs 24/7. I mean, there's so much going on, and solar plus storage is now the cheapest form of electricity humans have ever known. We can reduce inequalities which are being exacerbated by climate change. We can create healthy ecosystems and food systems. We can give us a world that's safer and more stable, and we could also fix climate change too. Who's not on board with these things? Let me just give you 2 examples. Food waste. If food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd biggest emitter of heat-trapping gases in the world. We waste enough food every year to double the amount that's needed to feed people who don't have enough. 1 billion people don't have enough food, and we waste enough food to feed 2 billion people every year. In low-income countries, that food is wasted because it doesn't get to market or it goes bad. So 2 different companies have created, one is a sticker that you put on fruit, and the other is a spray-on polymer that cuts food waste and helps people get enough food to eat. Oh, and it helps with climate change too. This is a picture of the mango, as you can see. What about greening low-income neighborhoods? It turns out that in any given city, like Louisville, Kentucky, low-income neighborhoods can be up to 15 degrees hotter during a heat wave than a high-income neighborhood in the same city. And the number one reason is lack of green space. And why do they lack that green space? Historic racist redlining practices with insurance and mortgages that didn't allow them to develop parks or green areas. And not only that, but it's more pollution in those areas too. We've looked at, and at the Nature Conservancy, we actually ran an experiment where we worked with a local community to help them plant trees and green their neighborhood, and then the medical school at the university tracked the levels of inflammation in people's bodies in that neighborhood and an adjacent neighborhood that was not getting green. They found an incredible reduction in inflammation, which causes heart disease, it affects lung disease, it affects mental health, it affects all kinds of issues. So what does this do? It improves people's health, reduces pollution, advances equity, it helps people prepare for flood and heat, and it provides a place for biodiversity in the middle of cities. How many wins is that? 5. Then we know that we need clean energy. But in some states like Virginia, the number one cause of deforestation is solar farms. We don't want that, right? So at the Nature Conservancy, we created a tool called the Site Renewables Right tool. And we have maps by state of where you do and where you don't want to put the solar and the wind. And it turns out that we did an analysis and we showed that if you look at brownfields and mining sites and roadways, we have more than enough land for all the wind and all the solar we need to become net zero by 2050. Without interfering with any valuable agricultural land, without cutting down any forests, without taking over any grasslands, and without siting in any migratory pathways. So these are the types of wins that we need. And what we can also do is we can talk about what we're doing. And I love the fact that my colleagues, my scientist colleagues, are doing this. This is Dr. Gaurav Basu. He is a medical professional who works on climate health. He electrified his home. This is my colleague Kim. She bikes to work, and her kids all bike to school, and she posts about it all the time. These are our solar panels that we got on our house. My husband got them for me for Christmas as a surprise. I was so happy when he told me. I cried. And then I found out that the installer put his leg through the roof of our bedroom. But we fixed that. And then this is my colleague Henry. He's an oceanography student. He plays online gaming. And what does he do while he's playing online games? He talks about climate change. The Fortnite audience needs to know too, right? So what other things can we share? You probably think corporations aren't doing anything, right? And there's a lot more that corporations could be doing. Let me be clear about that. But did you know that the top corporate buyer of clean energy is Amazon? The number 2 is Meta. Then we've got some other names that you might recognize here. There's a lot going on. And this is really cool. I was asking the students I was talking about today, do you know this? 10 years ago, the world was heading for a 4 to 5 degree warmer world by the end of the century. And 10 years later, thanks to all the policies that have been enacted in just 10 years, we're headed for a world that is 2.7 degrees warmer. Now, that's still a lot. We need it to be lower, but compare 2.7 to 4 or 5 in 10 years. Did you know that? We never talk about this. Why not? You know now. What gets the most clicks and shares? Doom-filled news, right? We have a bias against the progress that we've made. And so as a result, most of us think that climate action looks like this. It's a giant boulder that is not moving an inch, and it's got one tiny little girl trying to push it. And it's not moving, we think. But when we understand all that's happening, we realize that giant boulder, it's already rolling down the hill. It's got millions of hands on it, and if we add our hand and if we use our voice to encourage others to add theirs, it will go faster. That, to me, is the definition of efficacy. So climate changes, and we're worried. What do we do next? Do we load up our wheelbarrow? No, why not? It gets the most shares, but it doesn't motivate people to act. We want to address what? The head to heart and the heart to hands gap. How do we do that? We share why it matters to the people and places and things we love, to soccer, to our gardens, to our coastlines, to our business, to our home insurance. And what else do we share? What real solutions look like. And what happens? It turns out that people feel empowered, and that's when change happens. So I went back to the neuroscientist, and I found something incredible that she said about the way our brains work. She said, the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. Now, how much of our forward action on climate change is motivated by avoiding harm? 110%. She says this isn't the way our brain works. Reframe your message. And she wasn't talking about climate change. She's just talking about our brain. She says reframe whatever your message is so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. Isn't that incredible? It seems so obvious. So what does talking change? It turns out there's a huge body of research, not in climate, but in social science, on what talking changes. When we talk about something, it changes who we see ourselves as. It changes what people around us think. It changes what we perceive to be normal or not normal. It changes our sense of efficacy. And it changes our ability and our willingness to act. So is talking enough? Of course not. But is talking vital and necessary as a first step? It absolutely is. Sarah Peach is the editor of Yale 360, and she says, talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. Well, guess what? It is absent. So why can't we solve this problem? Because most of us aren't talking about it. She goes on and says the goal is not to, and I would paraphrase this as whack people upside the head, right? The goal is not to guilt them, to judge them, or to lecture them about the polar bears again. The goal is to bring them into the conversation. And how do you bring them in? By talking about what? What they care about. After I wrote my book, people were like, okay, well, your book had lots of great stories in it, but it wasn't enough. So I started a newsletter. And if you want the newsletter, you can just take a picture there, or you can go to talkingclimate.ca. As you can tell by the way I talk, I am Canadian. When I first moved to Texas, I went to the grocery store and I was trying to find something. And I asked a lady there where it was. And she's like, what are you saying? And I repeated it. And she's like, what are you looking for? And I repeated it. And then she said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Canada. And she said, oh, you're speaking French. So every week now, I share good news, color-coded green. Not so good news, color-coded red, so you can skip it if you want to. And blue, what you can do. So there is no excuse. If you want to have a conversation, I have you covered with 3 new pieces of heart and hands information every single week. And so people often ask me, and in fact, if you go to my Instagram account, or if you go to my Threads account, you will see my answer to this question pinned to the top. This is where this comes from. Nowadays, the number one question I get is not where do you find hope, it's what can I do? And according to the science, the number one thing that you can do about climate change is not recycling, though recycling is good. It's not composting, although composting is good. It's not eating more plants, although eating more plants is good. And it's not getting solar panels or driving a plug-in car, though both of those are good too. The number one thing we can do, as Bill McKibben says, a wonderful author who I'm sure many of his books are here, as Bill says, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. What does he mean? He means we need system change, right? We need the easiest and cheapest choice for everyone to be the best choice. And right now it's not. Right now, the easiest and cheapest choice for most people is the worst choice, right? So we have to change a system. But what is a system made of? People. And how does a system change? When people call for it to change. So a couple of years ago, I was part of a group of 30 scientists that Netflix assembled after the Don't Look Up movie came out. Anybody seen Don't Look Up? It was really difficult for me to watch. I mean, I used to be, if you've seen it, it opens in a scene in a astronomical dome where the woman who's the main character is a graduate student and she's taking astronomical observations that discover this asteroid. I used to do that. I worked in a dome just like that. And then she goes on TV and can't believe that people aren't listening to her and they just want to talk about the latest celebrity breakup. Well, you know the number of times I have been dumped from national news interviews because of breaking news? I identified with that very strongly. In fact, I had to stop halfway through the movie and then start it up again. But when it got to the end, I was like, what happened? It's all over. And so I said, well, when Netflix reached out to me, they're like, would you like to do something related to this movie? I said, well, yes, I would like to restart the movie halfway through, and I would like to show how individual people using their voice to advocate for change completely altered the outcome. And they're like, oh, we think Leonardo's already on to another project. I was like, I didn't think you were really going to do that. But they said, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll get together a bunch of experts and we will put together this awesome list of what people can do to alter the trajectory of an asteroid that's going to hit the Earth, or in other words, climate change. And when we did, this is the list we came up with. This is a science-based list on the most important things people can do to make a difference. So if you're worried and you want to make a difference, number one, start a conversation about what? Well, not just climate change. What matters to who? To the person you're talking with. Yes. And what else? What solutions look like? You can't talk just about the problem. You have to talk about the solutions. Otherwise, you have everybody worried and everybody paralyzed. Number two, join a climate action group to help amplify your voice. And I know there's people here who are part of that. Number three is really interesting. Consider where you keep your money. Your bank, your credit card, your retirement, your investments. As someone said to me today, money moves the world, right? And all of us have a role to play in that. Spark ideas where you work, where you study, where you worship. How does an organization change? It changes when one person says, hey, have we thought about this? And then, this one's really interesting, hold politicians accountable. That includes voting. But remember we talked about how we underestimate how much people care? Well, at Yale, they did another study that showed that politicians underestimate how much their constituents care. Every single one of them. Why? Yes, you got it. Because no one tells them. So it isn't only about voting, it's about telling the politicians that you care. And where's the best place to start a conversation with a politician? Now, I realize you might not agree with me, but they're humans too. And we have some politicians in this room who can verify that. And where do humans like to start the conversations? We all want to start with what? What we care about. So if you're going to have a conversation with an elected leader, and believe me, I'm not just talking federal, at the state, at the county, at the city level, so much can happen. Where do you start the conversation? With what they care about, and show them how they're the perfect person to care and what solutions look like that could be practical and that could have multiple benefits to bring more people in. And then lastly, I love this last one. Yes, take personal steps. Take personal steps to reduce our personal contribution. We live in high-income country, and our contribution is outsized compared to everybody else's. Take personal steps, but make them, actually not but, and, make them contagious by what? By talking about them, which changes our social norms. So don't just do it, tell people around about it too. The Garden Club of America is one of my favorite places to speak. A number of years ago, when I was first speaking with them, I met a woman who said, I do it all. She said, I've been vegan for 20 years. I garden only with native plants, and I support local pollinators. I drive a plug-in car. I have solar panels. I hardly ever fly anymore. And she's like, but none of my friends care. And so I said, well, how often do you talk about it with them? And she's like, oh, never. It's like, well, that is how you magnify the impact of everything you do. Imagine she's got years, decades of stuff stored up that she can share and help make contagious. So if you're worried, this is what we can do to really make a difference. So last point now, if you feel this way, here are 4 things you need to know. You're not alone. It's a rational response. It means you get it, you understand. Number 3, worry is good, but only if we know what to do. We don't want everybody worried but paralyzed. People have to know what to do. And this is my favorite. It turns out that love-driven action has changed the world before, and I'm convinced it can. So when the last big IPCC report came out, you know, those giant doorstops of 10-point font that are all about the doom and gloom, right? Because that's what we do as scientists. Time asked me to write an essay about it. And so I had to dig deep. I'm like, what am I going to say, right? I mean, this stuff is depressing. So I didn't look back to the data. I looked back in history, and I realized the world has changed before. And when it did, it was not because a president or a prime minister or a CEO or a big, rich, famous person decided it had to. Change did not begin with the King of England waking up one morning and saying, we'll just end slavery today. No, that's not what happened. The president of the U.S. didn't say, oh dear, that was a beautiful dinner you cooked tonight. You should get a vote. No, that is not the way a woman got the vote. The National Party of South Africa didn't say, it's time for summer vacation, let's end apartheid. No, all of these massive societal changes, which were at the scale needed, they were at the scale that we need today. They began when ordinary people of no particular power, wealth, or fame decided the world could and should be different. So who were the few names we know, the Wilberforces, the Stantons, the Mandelas, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s of the world? Who were all the people who shared and supported and fought for their visions? They were people who had the courage of their convictions, who used their voices to advocate for the systemic societal changes needed. Those people, they were us. We are the people who changed the world before, and that's why I know that we're the people who can change it again. I work with an organization called Potential Energy that just finished a big survey of the whole world asking people why they care about climate change. And what they found is that it isn't just about fear versus hope. They said the biggest motivator they found is what? Love. They tested messages. They tested messages like, do people want to act on climate change to increase jobs or to reduce inequality? And yeah, people did care about that. How about to protect our health or protect ourselves from extreme weather? Yeah, those are growing. But around the world, they found that the number one reason people care is love. And if that's the case, my only question is, what are we waiting for? Do we not all love somebody, something, somewhere? And whatever it is we love, it's at risk. And who's more at risk than the people we love most in the world, right? So because of that, I'm really convinced that we can do it.
Thank you, Katharine.
Thank you. Every decision we make these days, it is a climate decision. And if we don't think we're including climate, then we're actually making a decision in the wrong direction. But the good news is I'm absolutely convinced that every person has the reason they need to care. And frankly, as research has shown, right? Every person, a reason to care, maybe not about themselves or their own kids, but about the future. We all want a better future. And if we start a conversation there, I really believe that we can address this. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine. Thank you.